The arrow was still moving when it hit him. Not a clean puncture, not a soldier's bullet that tears through and exits. An arrow, a properly made, deliberately engineered arrow, was designed to stay, to anchor, to resist every instinct the body had to expel it. The man on the ground knew this. His companions knew this. The surgeon, if there even was one within 500 miles, knew this better than anyone. What happened next was not medicine, it was mechanics, and it was brutal. The American frontier left behind a physical record that most history books refuse to examine closely. Battlefield surgeons' field notes, Army medical reports filed in triplicate and then largely forgotten. The journals of mountain men who operated on themselves with the same hands they used to skin beaver pelts. Diaries kept by pioneer women who boiled instruments they didn't have names for, over fires they couldn't afford to let die. This is that record, unvarnished, uncompromised, exactly as they left it. To understand the wound, you must first understand the weapon. A Plains warrior's arrow was not a simple stick. It was a precision instrument, the product of hours of careful work. The shaft straightened over heat and smoothed to a near-perfect cylinder. The fletching bound with sinew and a slight helical twist. To induce rotation and flight, the head attached deliberately loose or with a weakened binding. That last detail was not an accident. It was a design feature. When the shaft was pulled, the arrowhead stayed, buried in muscle, pressed against bone, invisible to any hand that reached in after it. Plains tribes had studied human anatomy through centuries of warfare, long before European anatomical texts crossed the Atlantic. They knew exactly what they were building. The fletched end also told a story. Tribes marked their arrows individually. Specific notching patterns, distinctive paint markings, unique sinew wrapping styles. Army surgeons learned to read these signatures like forensic evidence, material evidence of who had been there, where the ambush had originated, sometimes even which warrior had loosed the shot. The arrow was simultaneously a weapon, a signature, and a message. When it entered a man, it did not merely pierce. The broadhead, typically knapped flint, traded iron, or later recycled barrel-hoop steel hammered cold on a flat rock, spread tissue rather than cut cleanly through it. The entry wound was often deceptively small. The internal damage was not. Surgeon DeWitt Peters, writing in the 1860s while serving with U.S. Army units on the Southern Plains, recorded what he encountered with the dry precision of a man who had long since run out of horror to feel. The arrow, when deeply impacted, becomes bound by surrounding tissue, which contracts upon the shaft with considerable force. Simple extraction by pulling the visible end produces in most cases either rupture of the shaft, leaving the head concealed within, or tearing of deep structures which would not otherwise have been compromised. This was the central problem. The arrow that could be seen was often the least dangerous part of what was inside a man. The frontier answer to this problem was not elegant, but it worked. If the arrowhead had passed nearer through to the opposite side of the body, the preferred technique was counter-pressure extraction. Pushing the arrow completely through, rather than pulling it back. A man might grip a wooden block, another might press both hands flat against his ribs, while a third pushed the shaft forward with slow, even force. The moment the head breached the skin on the exit side, it was grabbed with pliers, forceps, or bare fingers. The shaft was then drawn backward and free. Jimson weed was chewed into a poultice and packed into both wounds. Turpentine, if available, was poured directly into the channel. It burned like hellfire and prevented infection in roughly the same proportion. The man was then sewn shut, or not, depending on available thread, available light, and whether the surgeon's hands had stopped shaking yet. But when the arrow had not passed through, when it sat buried at an angle in deep muscle or worse, pressed against the spine or a major vessel, the procedure changed entirely. A probe went in first, typically a smooth metal rod, though men used whittled sticks, ramrods, even index fingers when nothing else existed. The probe traced the wound channel, mapped its direction, identified the resistance of the head. The surgeon closed his eyes sometimes, not from squeamishness, but because he was reading information through his fingertips that his eyes couldn't reach. Depth, angle, whether the head was flat or head rotated, whether it was touching bone. Then came the knife. The incision extended the wound in the direction of the shaft's travel, widening the channel just enough to admit 2 fingers and a forceps. This was not cutting blindly. This was deliberate anatomical work, performed with whatever light existed, a lantern, a fire, the gray flat light of a prairie dawn, by men who had learned not from medical schools, but from the accumulated experience of other men who had survived. Mountain man Jim Bridger carried an arrowhead embedded near his spine for 3 years before anyone removed it. 3 years of riding, sleeping on hard ground, lifting, fighting. When surgeon Marcus Whitman finally extracted it in 1835 at a fur trade rendezvous, no anesthetic, no operating table, an audience of trappers and flathead warriors watching with frank curiosity, Bridger reportedly observed the fuss with characteristic indifference. He had, after all, been living with it. Fire was the secondary surgeon. Always. Cauterization, the direct application of heat to an open wound, sealed vessels, destroyed surface infection, and bought time. The implement was whatever was available. A trade knife blade heated in coals until it glowed orange-red. The curved tip of a powder horn, a flat piece of scrap iron. The application lasted 2 to 4 seconds. The sound it produced was distinctive and, to anyone who heard it once, entirely unforgettable. The smell was worse. Army Surgeon General William Hammond, in his 1863 treatise on military surgery, noted with clinical precision that frontier cauterization, while medically primitive by contemporary standards, demonstrated a statistically measurable reduction in wound mortality when compared to equivalent wounds left open on the frontier, particularly in hot weather, where bacterial contamination of untreated wounds progressed with extraordinary speed. Heat killed what was invisible. The frontier had understood this long before germ theory gave it a name. The women in this story are often missing from the official record. They should not be. Pioneer women and tribal women both served as the primary wound care practitioners across the frontier. The material evidence of this is scattered through diaries and letters, brief, practical, unsentimental entries that describe procedures with the same matter-of-fact tone used to describe baking bread or mending harness leather. One Kansas settler woman, writing to her sister in 1868, her name lost to history, her account preserved in a county archive, described the night she extracted an arrowhead from her husband's shoulder with a pair of kitchen tongs she had heated and then cooled. I told him to hold still and think of something else. He did not hold still. I worked around it. She had packed the wound with a poultice of plantain leaves and rendered lard. She had bound it with strips of her underskirt. Her husband survived. She does not record whether she was frightened. She records that she boiled the tongs afterward. Among the Plains tribes themselves, wound treatment carried its own sophisticated tradition. Comanche and Cheyenne warriors who survived arrow wounds were treated with herb poultices of specific, regionally sourced plants. Yarrow for bleeding, puffball spores applied directly to raw tissue to accelerate clotting, buffalo tallow packed into deep channels as both sealant and antimicrobial agent. Sweat lodge therapy followed serious wounds, the sustained heat reducing inflammation, the purging inducing deep physiological rest. Army surgeons who studied these outcomes in the field noted, in reports, they sometimes struggled to reconcile with their own professional training that survival rates among warriors treated with traditional methods compared favorably with those treated in field hospitals. The frontier, in its violence, had produced its own medical literature, written in skin and sinew, rather than paper and ink, but a literature nonetheless. What made a frontier surgeon was not a diploma. It was the willingness to look at what needed to be done, and then do it, methodically, without flinching, with whatever was at hand. A cavalry farrier who had spent 20 years working with iron became, by default, a man who understood the mechanical properties of metal and tissue both. A mountain man who had dressed out 10,000 animals understood anatomy with a tactile intimacy that no classroom produced. A Comanche medicine man who had treated warriors across 30 years of plains warfare had accumulated a clinical database that would not be matched in formal American medical literature until decades after the frontier had closed. They were not physicians by training, they were physicians by necessity. And necessity on the frontier was a far harsher instructor than any school. The arrow that entered a man on the southern plains in 1850 carried with it a complete set of problems, mechanical, biological, physiological, that demanded immediate, competent response from people who had no formal credentials and no institutional support. They responded with knives and fire, with plant knowledge and animal fat, with 3 years of experience and steady hands and the understanding that the man on the ground would live or die based entirely on what they did in the next 20 minutes. Most of the time, they got him up. Some of the time, they didn't. Either way, they kept working.